Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, welcome as well. So in today's video I wanted to take a look at the potential of Vice President Kamala Harris being the next president of the United States. And before we get to her charts, I just wanted to share a clip with you I recorded back in July 2020 when I said Joe Biden will become the next president of the United States. And at the time I also said I don't believe Joe Biden would seek re-election in 2024, and I'll share that clip here. So part of my prediction is, and what I think will happen, is that Joe Biden will win the election. He will, try and get a steady hand on the wheel, have people around him. But what I think will happen is I don't think he will even go for a second term into another election. And the reason for this is right now, when we get to around the election time in the solar directions, is this Aquarian stellium right now in degree terms is not really making that hard square to the natal Scorpio planets. We see here with Mercury at 21, it's not really going to be touching those degrees for quite some time. But I think as we move forward into 2024, as some of these degrees move further on and start squaring, I don't believe Joe Biden will be running again for a second term. So whether this is maybe a cognitive decline, health issue, I believe someone else will probably take the mantle and that he won't look for a second term. Okay, so before we get into the charts, I just wanted to check my own hubris and talk about the issues with political predictive work, in that I'm looking at these charts through a particular lens and through my own biases. And also to point out that all the views I express today may not be shared by Kepler College. Okay, so let's get into the charts, and the first one I want to look at today is Kamala's natal chart. Now, the advantage with Kamala's chart is that we have an AA Rodden rating, which is essential in any predictive work, and all of the charts I'm using today are all in whole sign. Now, when I pulled up Kamala's chart, one of the most interesting signatures I found was her dignified Saturn conjunct the midheaven. We've got Saturn in domicile in its own terms, pretty much setting its own agenda. Yes, we're retrograde and we're out of sect, but this is a highly dignified Saturn. Now, if we're talking about natal promise, I often find with charts with Saturn conjunct the midheaven is that there's an element here and the potential for authority or positions of authority. One of my favourite charts is the late Queen Elizabeth, who had Saturn conjunct the midheaven and her long reign over so many years. So this is one of the most striking elements I found in Kamala's chart. Now, what's interesting in terms of timing is that I don't have an extensive knowledge of Kamala's biography, but I do believe at the age of 5, her parents split, and that was a big deal in her life. And if we direct this Saturn by about 5 degrees, we are on the natal midheaven. So that's interesting in terms of timing. We can also look at Kamala's 4th house for disruptions in early life and family life. We've got the generational planets. We've got the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in the 4th house, which again gives credence to that early disruption with the parents divorcing and then moving away to a different location. But as today we're talking about her public standing, and we've also mentioned that potential for authority, which she has shown throughout her life, whether that's being a lawyer, the attorney general, a senator and vice president, that is very strong signature in Kamala's chart. Now, if we're looking at the ruler of the midheaven, we're going to take a look at the condition of Jupiter. Now, Jupiter is not in the best of shapes. It's retrograde in the 12th house. It doesn't have a great deal of dignity. Some accidental dignity we do have here. The dispositor, the ruler of the 12th house, is Venus, and the two benefics are making a mutual trine connection to one another. So we have Venus in the applying trine to Jupiter by about 7 degrees. Now, any Jupiter I find that's struggling a little bit in the chart, particularly ruling the midheaven, almost has a sense of this person has to work extra hard and has to have extra belief in attaining their calling, essentially, ruling the midheaven. And if you see Kamala Harris, how many, glass ceilings she's broken, whether that's being the first female person of color as vice president, all her roles in positions of authority in law, Saturn 9th house as well, whole sign, we can see this connection here. Now, another point to bring up about this Jupiter is if that you tot up all of the elements and modalities in this chart, it comes out to fixed Earth, which is activating this Jupiter as well in terms of the foundational energy and the chart signature. So it's something that might not catch your eye straight away, but Jupiter seems to be quite important in this chart. Now, I'm not going to do a full natal analysis today, but other interesting areas I find is we have the chart ruler, Mercury, in fixed water. We have Mercury in the terms of Mars, and Mars in the terms of Mercury. Now, I can't help but think of Kamala Harris in those roles as Attorney General, or being a prosecutor and a lawyer, and not being afraid to voice her opinions and not being afraid to go after the despicable people in society and prosecuting them, and not being afraid to go after some of the most dangerous people in society. And she's probably taken this from all of her roles, from lawyer to Attorney General to Senator, and right now as Vice President of the United States, not being afraid to voice her opinions and say what is right. And with Mercury in the 6th house as well, fighting for the underdog and giving a voice to those victims, as she was a prosecutor for a very long time. Another interesting connection in this chart is we have a T-square with the Saturn, the Jupiter, and the Mars. That Mars is applying the faster moving planet to this T-square. Now, these are all in fixed signs, and for me, this extra tension and this extra energy gets pushed through into the element of working hard to get where she wants to go to, and being in fixed signs, not being afraid and staying the course when she needs to. So being an Attorney General for a period of time and staying the course is very indicative of planets in fixed signs. And just this extra element of tension with the T-square, I think, gives extra impetus and extra power for Kamala in this chart. Another interesting connection we have is the North Node conjunct the Ascendant. For many people, they look at the nodes in different ways, but for me, it is in terms of bringing into this lifetime the direction you're heading. So for me, a North Node conjunct the Ascendant is "you do you," is my key phrase for this connection. It's that place of the first house, showing your personality, being upfront and bold. And if you connect this with all of the rest of the chart, I think that's very much apparent and what is manifested for Kamala in her life. Another interesting connection, which we've touched on before, the generational planets of the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which to me speaks to, especially in an angular house, of disruption and battling the status quo, which I think has been a theme throughout Kamala's life as well. Okay, so now I wanted to switch into Kamala's solar return for this year. One of the most interesting connections in this solar return is that we have solar return Saturn conjunct natal midheaven. And I think this just speaks to this theme of authority coming back around. And now that we know Joe Biden has stepped aside, is building up this year to be in a position of authority. And more likely than not, she'll be heading the ticket into the 2024 election. And I thought this was a very interesting and strong signature in the chart. Of course, she had her Saturn return in February of 2023. So we're in this pivotal time of Saturn. And if we bring it back to the natal chart, the natal promise of Saturn conjunct the midheaven, it just speaks to those common themes of authority and being in those particular positions. And now it looks like she will be heading the ticket. Other important points to note in this solar return is that we have the ruler of the ascendant and the midheaven, Mercury Cazimi of the sun, giving extra strength. Now, some astrologers will give 17 minutes of arc for Cazimi, but for me, I'll go up towards a minute. So looking at this chart, I'm going to call this Mercury Cazimi. And here we're in the 2nd house of values. Now, if you've been seeing her tours in the last year, she's really been going out there talking about reproductive health, talking about equality for women, and all of the values that she's expressed through her speeches as vice president. And now she'll likely become the head of the ticket for the Democratic Party for 2024. This Mercury is becoming even more prominent as she goes out on the campaign trail. Another interesting part to point out is that we have Kamala in her 12th house perfected year, making Venus Lord of the Year, which is prominent here. That is pulled up to the 1st house of the solar return. But it's also activating this Jupiter that we've talked about natally, and of course the importance of Jupiter ruling the natal midheaven. So for me, it's just reinforcing this theme of career's going to be in the spotlight, that sense of authority with Saturn, and with Jupiter being activated, this is a year where public standing and career is really highlighted, which is really coming into prominence right now. In terms of angles, what's interesting to note is that we have the natal ascendant lining up with the solar return midheaven, which can be a significant year as well. And as I'm going through these charts, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. I've only put this presentation together in the last 24 hours. So if you'd like to put your comments and observations, I'm sure I'm missing a number of delineations. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, looking at Kamala's solar return for the next couple of months, one of the most powerful signatures in this next upcoming solar return is that we have natal Pluto conjunct solar return midheaven. Now, could this be a public position of power to go from vice president to president as we go into 2025? I feel like this is a very strong signature. And one of the reasons my inclination is towards that she will, if she runs against Donald Trump, will be the next president of the United States. Another thing that is striking is that Kamala is going from a 12th house perfected year into a first house perfected year, which is a strong signature for pushing out into a new cycle, a new 12-year cycle, and you're pushing out into your personality, being out there, being prominent. So for me, it's just an extra indication, along with this Pluto on the solar return midheaven, of Kamala being more prominent as we go into 2025. Now, what could be a minor issue for Kamala is that in the first house perfected year, Mercury becomes Lord of the Year, and here we've got Lord of the Year in the 12th house. So could there be some minor issues here? That's a possibility, but I think overall, if you look at the chart all in combination, is a strong signature for me that she will end up being in a position of power and possibly being the next president of the United States. On top of that, we've got Venus conjunct the solar return ascendant, again reinforcing first house issues and being a personality out there. And in this particular chart, this brings up the 7th house of the natal chart. So really all of these combinations together are just screaming to me, being out in public, speaking one's mind, and again, pushing towards positions of power. Okay, so now I want to look at the combined charts for Election Day 2024. In the very inner wheel, we have Kamala's natal chart. The second wheel out, we have secondary progressions. Third wheel out, we have directions, solar art directions, and we have the transit in the final outer wheel. Breaking this down, there's a few interesting areas in all of these charts. Now, starting with the secondary progressions, I usually wouldn't talk about secondary progressed Saturn because it moves so slowly in a progressed chart, but any planet that's switching sign, we're going from here from fixed air to mutable water. This came in the progressed Saturn in the beginning of 2020, and 2020 saw Kamala become the vice president of the United States. So for me, it's just bringing up this theme of authority that we've talked about in previous charts. Now, reinforcing the theme of public standing and career, we have transiting Saturn going through Kamala's 10th house. And we also have the opposition here to the natal and progressed Uranus and Pluto. Now, they move very slow, so it's not overly notable, but we are having this Saturn opposition to these planets. So for me, it just speaks of shaking up the status quo. So will this be indicative of being the first female president and the first female president of color around this time? I'm leaning towards yes. Another interesting point in secondary progressions is that Kamala's progressed moon is in domicile going through the second house of values, which we touched on before. Now, if you want to take the moon as one of the archetypes, one of the female archetypes along with Venus, I think the strength of this moon comes back as we're talking about values here on her tour, talking about reproductive rights, women's issues and equality, reinforcing the themes that we were talking about before in previous charts. Now, to reinforce this theme, we can also look at the exalted Jupiter directing through her second house, which it has been doing for the last 24 years. And we talked before about Jupiter ruling the midheaven and the connection to public standing. And of course, for the last 24 years, she's had high positions of authority. And this directing exalted Jupiter, I think, has been playing a large role in her success in her career. And I think it just ties into this themes, again, of second house values and communicating them to the public and part of the public standing. Now, what's also important to note is that Kamala's progressed sun will be going into the critical degree in 2025 at 29 degrees Sagittarius. It's ruling the third house. Now, I believe she'll be elected, if she runs against Donald Trump, as the next president of the United States. So it'll be reinforcing those third house themes of communication at that critical degree, as eventually in 2026, she'll move into a whole new chapter of life as the progressed sun will go into cardinal Earth, which is going to be very interesting to keep an eye out as we look at Kamala's life in the next year or two. Now, do we have some issues here? We have directed midheaven, which is ruled by Venus. Now, natally, Kamala's Venus isn't particularly strong. And if we looked at directed Venus as well, we've got Venus in detriment. So maybe some issues there in terms of public standing. That might just be half of the country not agreeing with her and not wanting her to be the next president of the United States. And on top of that, we have directed Saturn at the critical degree in fall, which will eventually move into fixed Earth in October of 2025. So that's probably something to keep an eye out on too. Other interesting connections here is we have transit in Uranus, which has been hovering over natal Jupiter. Now, Jupiter again connected to the midheaven. Is this going to be a shake-up, the theme that we've had through these charts, the shake-up of the status quo, and the shake-up of how she's seen in public life and the role she plays, and is that going to be the next president of the United States? We also have transit in Jupiter going through a first house, so reinforcing those points we made before about being in a first house perfected year, that being prominent. We've got Jupiter transiting through the natal first house, being prominent, being outspoken, and being out there, which everything put together speaks to me of Kamala being the next president of the United States. Now, I've only put this presentation, as I've said before, in the last 24 hours, so there's probably important delineations I've missed in these charts. I'd certainly love to hear your thoughts in the comments and what you see in these charts and in terms of potential. It would be interesting if I look at Donald Trump's charts moving forward, and also looking at the mundane astrology, looking at the solar return of the United States, and all of these factors put together to see what outcome may come ahead. Okay, well, thank you all for listening. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. And again, my prediction will be, even looking through my own biases and through my own lens, is that Kamala Harris, if she goes against Trump in the 2024 election, I believe will be the next president of the United States. But we're certainly in for interesting times. So thank you all for watching this brief video, and I'll see you again in the next episode. Have a wonderful rest of your week.